Hello and welcome to the sixth session in my Bible study on the biblical case for LGBTQ inclusion. I am Pastor Ari Mattson. I am pastor of Martin Luther Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is part of the ELCA. And this is a Bible study I put together to explore how I changed my opinions, my thoughts, because of the biblical witness and how it led me to become an ally and welcoming and inclusive to the LGBTQ community. This is kind of a bonus one that I added after I started this series. And this is looking at what is the sin of Sodom, because this is a story that sometimes gets thrown around a lot as an example of God condemning homosexuality. But I think, as we'll see, it really has nothing to do with that. We're going to then look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in this session. So, what is Sodom's sin? That's going to be one of the central questions for us to think through and explore as we do this, because there's going to be talk about sin and Sodom being condemned for it. But what is that sin is going to be very important. We're going to look at that question from a variety of ways. So in Genesis 18, the Lord says, "How great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So as said, it has often been interpreted that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of homosexuality. But nowhere in this condemnation does God say that. And when we look at the text, we'll see the word homosexuality is never actually mentioned, and perhaps it's something else. So we'll read through this story and then look at it in larger context and ask some questions about it. So should also say, just to warn you, in this session, there's going to be some rather frank conversation about rape, about male genitalia, and about violence. So please listen, watch appropriately. And this opening text is a rather long one. So also make yourselves comfortable and be prepared for that. So Genesis 19, the two angels who had just met with Abraham, we'll hear about that soon, came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, and all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called on Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out to the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." It's important to recognize here, to know them is a biblical phrase, an ancient Hebrew phrase for having sex with. "Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city." But he lingered, so that the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and left him outside the city. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. All right, so a lot of stuff happening here. But you'll notice the author never defines the wickedness of Sodom. What do we see in the passage? Well, certainly we do see men coming and threatening to rape the men of the house. But then in response, there's kind of this horrific thing where Lot instead says, no, why don't you rape my daughters? Which is appalling in its own way. But we might want to ask, if the sin, the wickedness is raping men, then why would offering women as a substitute be helpful? And also note it says that like every man in the city comes out to do this. Are we to understand that every man in Sodom is homosexual, has homosexual desires? Well, how then does this city replenish or operate? That seems like that would be incredibly unusual, and we might hear more about that. So, though sexual attack is clearly a part of this, perhaps it's something else. And it should also be noted that they want to come and rape the men, right? They're not coming and saying, hey, we want to date the men. We're interested in getting to know them and having a healthy relationship with them. They're talking about rape, which we would say, yeah, rape is evil. That is awful. Whether or not you are raping someone of the same or a different gender, rape is violence and it is evil. So what else might be going on here? If we pull back a bit and look at the greater context, I think there's a really important clue in the chapter before. So in the chapter right before this, we have Genesis 18. And here we'll cover just a bit of that. So this is part of the greater Abraham story. Lot is Abraham's nephew and has gone to live in Sodom. They've both traveled from Mesopotamia to where they are near the Promised Land. And the chapter before is this: the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. And he said, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread and you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So we have this opening part to this story where first there are 3 men instead of 2. Later in the chapter, it will be revealed that the 3rd man that is visiting Abraham is the Lord, and the other 2 are the angels that go on to Sodom and stay at Lot's house. But you may have noticed there are some parallels that are happening here. In both of these chapters, they open up with Abraham and Lot sitting near the entrance to their camp or the city and see strangers. And when they do, they run forward, they bow down, they greet these strangers, and they ask them to stop and let them practice hospitality, to let them welcome them and give them food. Now, we sometimes think of hospitality as a nice thing to do, but it was a deeply moral thing for the early Hebrews. The idea of hospitality was considered deeply important, and to not offer hospitality would have been an incredible breaking of not just tradition, but what is considered appropriate. It would be tantamount to not just not saying please and thank you, but screaming and being rude to someone who tries to do something nice to you, right? offering hospitality to people, especially in the desert, or in places where they're strangers and don't have a place to stay. This is the day before Motel 6s and Holiday Inns. When you're traveling, you don't necessarily have a place where you can stay. So offering hospitality is deeply important. And it's a reflection of God's grace and God's love that Hebrew people share with other people, and later Christians, of course, in the same way. So we have this parallel. And Genesis wants very much for us to know that Abraham is a righteous man and that Lot is a righteous man. And so we see that here. Abraham's righteous. He runs, he bows, he greets, and feeds the strangers. Because of his righteousness, then, in the following verses, his covenant's renewed. Sarah shall have a son, and you shall have an extended family, the promise that has been made to him for several chapters now. And then in chapter 19, Lot is righteous. He runs, he bows, he greets, and feeds the strangers. And because he is righteous, then he is protected from the destruction that is to come to Sodom. The rest of the city is corrupted and awful, but he is protected. So in contrast to that, to this proper hospitality, to this welcoming of the stranger, we see the people of Sodom who instead want to rape or possibly even kill the strangers instead of welcoming them. It's quite possible that they see any strangers as a threat. You may notice in the text that they refer to Lot as this alien, this stranger that's come to live among us. How dare he tell us what to do, right? So there is that us-them mentality clearly in the people of Sodom. And so the sin that may be being practiced here is inhospitality and violence towards strangers rather than welcoming and caring for people in need. Now, there's a similar story that helps us, I think, get to some of that as well. This comes from the book of Judges, in Judges 19. And the feed into this story, the first 21 verses here, tells the story of a Levite whose concubine, which is kind of a second-tier wife, right? So it is a wife of his, runs away. She goes home, and he goes to retrieve her. There's probably a lot going on there that we're not told about, but he goes to retrieve her and from her father, and then starts heading home. As he's going, he stops in a town where he is, like in the other story, welcomed by a righteous man who invites him to come and stay at his house and gives him food. And then we get to this point. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a depraved lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Sounds very much like Lot, right? "Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them. But against this man, do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them. They wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down and died at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. You may notice there's a lot of similarities to the story of Sodom. The people, the men of the city come and say, "Bring out the stranger. We want to have sex with him." The host who is hosting the stranger says, "No, this is wicked. Don't do this," and offers instead alternatives from his own family and from the guests and the guest's wife instead. Again, suggesting that the idea of dishonoring a guest, attacking a guest, is apparently in his mind worse than raping his own daughter. We may disagree with that, but that's the cultural understanding that he is operating out of. What is the evil that is done here? The difference in this story is that rather than angels saving them, the Levite's concubine is tossed out to the men and they rape her to death, which is horrific and it's awful. What comes after this then is the Levite goes home and calls together the tribes of Israel and says, you won't believe what was done to me when in the tribe of Benjamin, in one of our own tribes. This is how I was treated. And they get together and they actually fight a really awful, violent war that leads to tens of thousands of deaths between the Benjamites and the rest of the tribes of Israel. So nowhere in the text, in this or in the war that follows, or any of the justification, does it say anything about sexual sin or perversion. Nowhere does it say, oh, these men they were homosexual, or these men wanted to have unnatural intercourse. No, it doesn't say that. And the Levite's very explanation, he says, they intended to kill me, a stranger in their place, and they raped my concubine until she died. They wanted to kill and to rape. Those were the sins that they committed. And we would see those as part of the greater sin of being inhospitable and attacking and hurting someone in need and someone who's vulnerable rather than offering help and welcome. So the city of Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin, they're condemned because of the inhospitality and the violence that they show to their own kinfolk. And so we can infer that the people of Israel would read the same in the story of Sodom. Since these are in the same Bible, they're only a few books apart from each other and written at similar times. We can infer that people reading the two stories would see that the issue in Sodom would be similar to the one in Gibeah, that it's inhospitality and that it's violence and that it's rape and wanting to kill. Those are the sins that they commit, not a sin, quote unquote, of homosexuality. So from another angle, there's something to look at here. What is going on in these stories? And so there is a term that's called phallocentric, and it refers to a belief or a type of culture in which the phallus or the penis is a symbol of dominance. If you have a phallus, if you have a penis, it means that you are superior to those who don't. Many ancient Near East cultures, and even some to today and other places around the world as well, are phallocentric. This idea that men are superior to women. And a big part of what makes a man is that he has a penis and uses it. So in a phallocentric culture, now this is where it's important to recognize something, that it's having and using a penis is what makes one a man and therefore superior. So a man who sexually penetrates another person, male or female, is masculine because he is using the penis to penetrate. That makes him masculine. Any person who is penetrated in a sexual act is not. So in a phallocentric understanding, a man can have sex with another man, and as long as he is not penetrated, then he is not homosexual. He is still masculine. He is still a man because he has used his penis to penetrate another person. So when the men of Sodom and the men of Gibeah come and talk about wanting to rape the strangers, if it's a phallocentric culture, then what they're actually saying is, we want to come and prove our masculinity and our superiority. By raping these strangers, we make them effeminate, we humiliate them, we prove that we're better than them because we're men and they're not. So it is a way of shaming them. It's a way of rejecting them. There may be several reasons for that. It may be that they see strangers coming into their city as a threat, as spies coming to do something evil. And so they want to send a message back to whichever, enemy city is sending spies to look at them. We're not going to put up with this. It may be that they are just incredibly insular and don't trust people they don't know. And this is the way they act. It's hard to say for sure, but if it is a phallocentric culture, and there's good reason to think that it would be, or at least that would be familiar to many of the people and the people writing and reading these stories, then the acts of the men of Sodom and the men of Gibeah are not homosexual acts because they are wanting to penetrate and rape another human being. And it doesn't matter if the other human being is male or female. If you are the one doing the penetration and raping, it proves your own masculinity and your own superiority. So whatever they may be wanting to do, they would not necessarily see what they're doing as a homosexual act. And again, the act of rape, regardless of who you're doing it against, is sinful. Forced sexual penetration against anyone, forced sex with anyone, we would say is inappropriate, is not in a line with what God intends sex to be, is not what God intends loving relationships to be. So the men probably don't think of themselves as homosexual. And even if they do, what they're attempting is rape and not just sex. Another angle that we can take on this story that's important is to look beyond it. Sodom and Gomorrah become example stories. Other places in the Bible, they're mentioned almost a dozen other times throughout the Bible. And the way that they are talked about can be an important way for us to understand how the biblical readers and writers understood this story. So we'll look at some examples here in Isaiah and Ezekiel. In Isaiah, the very beginning of the book, Isaiah writes, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom, and listen to the teaching of our God, you peoples of Gomorrah." Now, it's important to note here, he's not talking directly to Sodom and Gomorrah. He's using them as metaphors to talk to the people of Israel, who he thinks have gone so far and done things so awful as to become like Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's about to condemn them. What is he going to condemn them for? Look at this. "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil from your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow." Nothing about sexual activity, nothing about sexual sin here. The sin of Israel that Isaiah thinks is like the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is they're not practicing justice. They're not taking care of the oppressed and the orphan. They're not taking care of the widow, the helpless people within their culture. Instead, they are using power selfishly and violently and evilly, which is a very different way of thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah, other than if we assume that Sodom and Gomorrah is actually about homosexual acts, right? The problem with Sodom and Gomorrah, Isaiah seems to be saying, is that they failed to do justice. They failed to take care of people in need, which would go back to that idea of hospitality violations that I mentioned earlier. In Ezekiel, something pretty similar. "As I live, says the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done." So again, comparing the audience to Sodom. "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it." So the guilt of your sister Sodom, very specifically, prideful, had plenty of food and ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Again, nothing about sexuality, nothing about sex in any way. The problem, they did not care for those that were in need. The strangers that appeared before them, they tried to injure instead of trying to aid. That's the sin of Sodom, according to Isaiah and Ezekiel. So, according to these prophets, the sin is injustice, failure to care for the poor and needy. Other places, as I said, Sodom and Gomorrah get mentioned a lot in the Bible. Other places either suggest something very similar or they're just not clear. It just says Sodom and Gomorrah were bad, but it doesn't say why they were bad. So we can't draw a conclusion. Jude and 2 Peter are the only places in the Bible that talk about Sodom and Gomorrah in connection to sexual sin. One, we don't know a ton about these books. They're kind of passing references. And furthermore, 2 Peter probably copied from Jude, a lot of scholars believe. And so really it's Jude then that thinks that the sin of Sodom is sexual in nature, which goes against Isaiah and Ezekiel and other things that are there. It may be the case, but Jude's the only one in the Bible that seems to make that explicit connection, and then copied by the author of 2 Peter. Everywhere else, it suggests that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is either unclear, or it has more to do with a failure to do justice, a failure to care for the poor and the needy. So a summary of this story, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The men of Sodom clearly want to rape the visitors, which is sinful regardless of gender, right? Rape is a sin. It doesn't matter who you're raping. Lot's offer of his daughters and the parallel in Judges 19 suggests that homosexual desire is not the driving issue for the mob. Many cultures are phallocentric, and from that perspective, the actions of the men of Sodom and the men of Gibeah would not be homosexual. They would be trying to prove their masculinity by raping the men that are strangers. Hospitality is contrasted with Abraham in chapter 18. We see Abraham and Lot both acting in righteous, correct ways, and the men of Sodom doing the opposite. Rather than greeting and offering hospitality, they want to injure and chase off the strangers. And Isaiah and Ezekiel define Sodom's sin as failure to care for those in need, very specifically. So the sin of Sodom then does not seem to be anything having to do with homosexuality, but there's plenty of other evidence and very obvious suggestions that it's their failure to care for the stranger, it's their failure to provide for those who are in need, it's their failure to know and practice God's justice and God's welcome. That is the sin for which they are condemned. And so the warning to the rest of us is not to be so unwelcoming, to be so exclusive to people that we chase them off before we know them, or we treat them badly based on one small thing about themselves. So ironically, if anything, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah would say that to exclude the LGBTQ community is committing the sin of Sodom. To try to say that a group of people have to be chased off, or that we're going to threaten them and not include them, not welcome them, is ironically in the name of trying to fulfill what God wants us to do from the story of Sodom. In actuality, is probably doing exactly the thing that God warns us not to do in the story of Sodom, which is welcome the stranger, provide for them, create relationship, offer kindness and hospitality to whoever crosses your path, which in the end shows that the story of Sodom really, I think, is a text of inclusion and of welcome for people in the LGBTQ community. I want to thank you for joining me for this series. There was one more session that I did online with my group, but it was mostly a discussion. There wasn't really anything in it to share with you. So I'm not going to be recording that one. It was just another chance to kind of summarize things and go through this. But I hope this is helpful. I hope that these videos can be a good resource for people. And may God be with you and guide you and strengthen you in your faith and your walk. May you continue to grow in the likeness of Jesus Christ and to be a reflection of God's love and grace into this world that needs it so badly. So again, I'm Pastor Ari Mattson from Martin Luther Lutheran Church. Thank you for joining me for this Bible study. God's peace.